when I found 120 houses built on my property. I didn't call the police. I called my lawyer and started the most expensive game of chess this HOA has ever played. Picture this. You come home from working overseas for 2 years, and there's an entire neighborhood where your grandmother's cornfield used to be. Street signs reading Magnolia Lane and Dogwood Drive. Kids riding bikes on driveways poured over land that's been in your family for 80 years. A clubhouse with a pool sitting right where Babsier used to grow her prize-winning tomatoes. The HOA president? She laughed in my face when I showed her my deed, called me a scammer, threatened to have me arrested for trespassing on my own property. By the end of this story, I'll own their HOA, their management company, and if I play my cards right, their children's college funds. What would you do if you found an entire neighborhood built on your property? Let me know in the comments below, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this HOA nightmare reaches. My name's Thaddeus Kowalski, friends call me Thad, and I'm a third-generation Polish-American who spent the last 15 years working oil rigs everywhere from the North Sea to the Gulf of Mexico. Tough work, good money, and it kept me away from home for months at a time. Home being 40 acres of Georgia clay that my grandmother Babsia left me when she passed. Babsier Kowalski was tougher than a $2 steak and twice as salty. She bought that land in 1943 with money she saved cleaning rich folks' houses. 40 acres of red dirt, pine trees, and the sweetest well water you ever tasted. The old farmhouse sat on a hill overlooking fields where she grew enough vegetables to feed half the county during the Depression. When she died 5 years ago, I inherited everything. The house, the barn, the timber rights, and every square inch of that beautiful, worthless-looking land. I kept paying the property taxes from whatever rig I was working. Figured I'd retire there someday. Fix up the old place, maybe raise some cattle. The smell of diesel fuel and salt spray was still in my clothes when I drove up that gravel driveway 2 weeks ago. What I found made my blood pressure spike higher than a Christmas tree. Magnolia Estates. 120 cookie-cutter houses with perfect lawns, a clubhouse that looked like a country club, and a swimming pool where Babsia's chicken coop used to stand. Street signs, fire hydrants, mailboxes with little decorative flags, the works. I sat in my pickup truck for 20 minutes, just staring. The sound of children laughing in what used to be our family cemetery. The crunch of fresh gravel under bicycle tires. Even the air smelled different. Chlorine from pool chemicals mixed with the artificial scent of fresh mulch. That's when I met Vivian Blackwood. Picture every HOA horror story you've ever heard, wrap it in a white BMW and perfectly highlighted hair, then give it a law degree and a husband on the county commission. Vivian was standing in her front yard, my front yard, directing a landscaping crew with the authority of someone who'd never been told no in her entire privileged life. I walked up to her with my survey documents and property deed, polite as Sunday church. "Ma'am, I think there's been some kind of mistake. This is my land." She looked me up and down like I was something stuck to her shoe. Work boots, faded jeans, the kind of tan you get from honest labor under foreign suns. "Honey," she said, voice dripping with fake sweetness, "this is a respectable neighborhood. Whatever scam you're running won't work here." I handed her the deed, watched her face go from condescending to confused to white as fresh paint. "This has to be fake," she stammered. "Ma'am, that deed's been in my family since 1943. Your clubhouse is sitting on my grandmother's grave." She slammed the door so hard the decorative wreath fell off. Through the window I could see her on the phone, gesturing wildly. Probably calling her husband Bradley, the county commissioner who'd somehow managed to approve a 120-home development on land he didn't own. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as I walked back to my truck. These people had built their American dream on my family's legacy, and they thought a working man wouldn't have the resources to fight back. They were about to learn that 15 years on oil rigs teaches you more than just how to work with your hands. When you're dealing with international maritime law, billion-dollar contracts, and lawyers from 12 different countries, you pick up a few things about how the world really works. That night, I slept in my truck outside the old farmhouse, now the centerpiece of Vivian's fancy neighborhood, and started planning the most expensive chess game these people had ever played. Within 48 hours, Vivian Blackwood had declared war. She filed a restraining order claiming I was unstable and threatening to the safety of Magnolia Estates residents. The petition described me as a transient individual with a history of violence who was attempting to perpetrate a land fraud scheme against innocent homeowners. History of violence? Lady, the only thing I'd ever fought was roughnecks who couldn't hold their liquor and North Sea storms that tried to sink my rig. But Vivian wasn't just throwing legal papers around. She was working the neighborhood like a politician at a barbecue. Emergency HOA meeting. Printed flyers warning residents about the dangerous con artist targeting their community. She even started a WhatsApp group called Protect Magnolia Estates, where she shared my license plate number and told people to call 911 if they saw me. The buzz of 120 households melting down simultaneously sounds like angry bees trapped in a mason jar. Her husband Bradley fast-tracked a retroactive zoning variance through the county commission. Backdated permits. Emergency approval for the subdivision that had somehow been accidentally delayed in processing. The man was rewriting history faster than Stalin's propaganda department. Meanwhile, I was doing what oil rig workers do best: methodical problem-solving under pressure. I hired Jenkins Land Surveying, the most respected firm in 3 counties. Cost me $2,000, but when you're fighting for 40 acres worth millions, you don't cheap out on ammunition. Their GPS equipment confirmed what I already knew. Every single house, every street, every blade of artificially green grass sat squarely on Kowalski family land. But here's where it got interesting. The original developer, Pinnacle Construction, had filed their permits using a property description that didn't match any existing survey. They'd literally made up coordinates and submitted them to the county. And guess who was listed as Pinnacle's legal counsel on the incorporation papers? Vivian Blackwood Esquire. This woman hadn't just moved into a house built on stolen land. She'd helped steal it. Mini twist time. Vivian's restraining order required her to prove she had legal standing to file it. That meant proving she actually owned the property she was trying to protect. When the judge asked for her title documentation, she couldn't produce it, because there wasn't any. Here's your knowledge nugget. Adverse possession laws don't apply to property with active tax payments. I'd been paying taxes on this land for 5 years straight, even while working overseas. Takeaway? Always check who's actually paying property taxes before assuming ownership. The judge gave her 30 days to produce clear title, gave me the right to post signs on my property during the investigation. I didn't post no trespassing signs, I went bigger. I spent $300 at the local print shop for vinyl banners. Big ones. Welcome to Kowalski Land, family owned since 1943. Included a QR code linking to the public records proving my ownership. Strung them up on fence posts throughout the development like Christmas decorations. The creak of old fence posts bearing the weight of truth sounds sweeter than church bells. But I wasn't done. If these people wanted to live on my land, they could pay rent. $50 per day per household. Posted notices on every door explaining the temporary trespassing fee structure while ownership was being determined. Included my Venmo account for convenient payment. The neighborhood exploded. Property values dropped faster than a lead balloon. Real estate agents started warning clients away from Magnolia Estates. The Protect Magnolia Estates WhatsApp group turned into a digital civil war between residents who blamed Vivian for the mess and those who wanted to lynch me. Some folks actually tried to pay the $50, figured it was cheaper than lawyers. That's when I knew I had them. Vivian's next move was predictable. She tried to rally the troops, called another emergency meeting, rented the VFW hall when the clubhouse got too crowded, stood up in front of 200 panicked homeowners and promised them she'd destroy this outsider who threatens our way of life. The acrid smell of stress sweat in that packed hall could have peeled paint. But here's what she didn't know. I'd been recording everything. Every threat, every lie, every admission that she knew the development was built on questionable land. My phone had been running continuously since our first conversation. When she stood up at that meeting and said, "We all know these people target hardworking families who've invested their life savings," she just handed me evidence of discriminatory intent. Maritime law teaches you to document everything because international contracts can hinge on a single recorded conversation. The sound of car doors slamming as residents rushed home to research property fraud lawyers was music to my ears. Vivian's next move came straight from the dirty politics playbook. If you can't win on facts, destroy your opponent's credibility. She hired Apex Investigations, a private detective agency that specialized in background research for family court proceedings. Translation: they dug up dirt on divorced dads and deadbeat spouses. Their job was to find something, anything, that would make me look like an unfit property owner. When that failed, turns out 15 years of clean maritime employment records and Navy veteran status don't scream dangerous criminal. She escalated, filed a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent, claimed my obsession with fraudulent property claims indicated severe psychological disturbance requiring state intervention. The woman was actually trying to have me committed so she could steal my land legally. But Vivian made one crucial mistake. She underestimated small-town networks. Martha Sandoval had worked as county clerk for 38 years before retiring. She knew where every skeleton was buried, which politicians owed favors to whom, and exactly how much Bradley Blackwood's consulting fees had increased since joining the county commission. Martha also happened to be my grandmother's bridge partner, and the only person Babsier trusted with her famous pierogi recipe. The smell of fresh coffee and old secrets filled Martha's kitchen as she laid out the real story. The Blackwood boy received $2 million from Pinnacle Construction, she said, sliding photocopied bank statements across her kitchen table, called it a feasibility study fee for county development planning. Funny thing about feasibility studies, they usually happen before you build 120 houses, not after. Martha had kept copies of everything. County Commission meeting minutes showing Bradley knew about my ownership. Environmental impact studies that had been falsified. Building permits backdated to cover the illegal construction. And the crown jewel? Recorded phone calls between Vivian and Pinnacle executives planning the acquisition of my property. Mini twist time. Turns out my 15 years working international oil rigs had given me more than just a good savings account. Maritime law requires understanding complex property rights, international contracts, and dispute resolution. I wasn't just some blue-collar guy they could intimidate. I was certified in handling multi-million-dollar legal disputes across multiple jurisdictions. More importantly, I had connections. Forensic accountants who specialized in tracking money through offshore drilling companies. Lawyers who understood RICO statutes. People who made their living untangling international fraud schemes. Here's your knowledge nugget. RICO laws apply to property fraud when multiple parties conspire across state or county lines. Takeaway: document everything when dealing with suspected corruption. Patterns matter more than individual incidents. I filed federal RICO charges against Vivian, Bradley, and Pinnacle Construction. Alleged criminal conspiracy to defraud a property owner. Requested immediate asset freezing for all defendants pending investigation. And just for fun, I simultaneously filed adverse possession claims against all HOA common areas, the pool, clubhouse, and playgrounds they'd built on my land. The rumble of news vans arriving in Magnolia Estates sounded like distant thunder. Vivian's panic response was spectacular. She tried to flee to her sister's house in Sarasota, got pulled over at the Georgia-Florida border with suitcases full of financial documents and $40,000 cash. Bradley attempted to resign from the county commission for health reasons, but got served with federal subpoenas before he could submit his paperwork. Pinnacle Construction suddenly declared bankruptcy, though their executives had somehow managed to transfer all assets to a new company called Magnolia Development LLC. The week before, that's when the HOA board made their fatal mistake. They levied an emergency assessment of $15,000 per household to fund their legal defense against my frivolous lawsuit. Imagine coming home from work to find a letter demanding $15,000 to fight a lawsuit that exists because your HOA president helped steal the land your house sits on. The residents' revolt was swift and merciless. The taste of metal from stress-grinding teeth became the neighborhood's unofficial flavor. Two factions emerged. Team Thad, who wanted Vivian's head on a pike, and Fight the Claim, who viewed me as an outside threat to their American dream. The neighborhood Facebook group became a digital battlefield. Real estate agents fled like rats from a sinking ship. Property showings dropped to zero. But the most beautiful part? Some residents started doing their own research. Turns out when you buy a house, you're supposed to get something called clear title. About 60 families discovered their title insurance specifically excluded coverage for fraud by the seller. The chemical smell of photocopying machines working overtime drifted from every real estate office in town as lawyers scrambled to understand how an entire subdivision had been built without anyone actually owning the land. Local news picked up the story when Martha leaked the financial documents to her nephew at WGST. County Commissioner received millions in questionable consulting fees, made for excellent Friday night ratings. Desperation makes people stupid, and Vivian Blackwood was about to prove that theory in spectacular fashion. Her first offer came through a lawyer, $500,000 cash, immediate settlement, full confidentiality agreement. When I laughed and hung up, she tried a different approach. If she couldn't buy me off, she'd frame me. The setup was amateur hour. Vivian's 22-year-old son, Derek, trust fund kid with a criminal justice degree and delusions of cleverness, spray-painted thigh beef across my grandmother's barn at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Problem was, I'd installed military-grade security cameras throughout the property after the first vandalism attempt. Watching Derek stumble around in the dark with a can of Krylon Red, occasionally stopping to check his phone for directions to the barn, was better entertainment than Netflix. But Vivian wasn't satisfied with petty vandalism. She escalated to planting evidence. Had Derek dump stolen HOA equipment, pool maintenance gear, landscaping tools, even a riding mower on my property, then called the sheriff to report the theft. The mechanical hum of my security cameras rotating to track their movements sounded like a cat purring. Police Chief Ronald Hutchins arrived with all the enthusiasm of a man who'd rather be fishing. Turned out he was Bradley Blackwood's golf buddy and regular poker partner. The investigation consisted of Chief Hutchins glancing at the planted evidence, shaking his head sadly, and explaining that he'd have to arrest me unless I cooperated with the HOA's reasonable requests. I handed him a USB drive containing 48 hours of security footage showing Derek's crimes in glorious 4K resolution. "Chief," I said, "either arrest that boy for trespassing, vandalism, and evidence tampering, or explain to the FBI why you're covering for him." The taste of adrenaline during our midnight stakeouts was bitter as black coffee, but worth every sleepless hour. Mini twist time. While researching the property deed for my lawsuit, I discovered something that changed everything. My grandmother's original deed included mineral rights to the property. And according to recent geological surveys filed with the state, my 40 acres sat on top of confirmed natural gas deposits worth more than $50 million. Suddenly, Pinnacle Construction's aggressive interest in this particular piece of worthless farmland made perfect sense. But here's where it got really interesting. Digging through Bradley Blackwood's financial records, now public thanks to the federal investigation, I found a 99-year gas lease agreement, signed in my name, with my forged signature, authorizing extraction on my property for the next century. Here's your knowledge nugget. Mineral rights often stay with the original property owner unless explicitly sold separately. Takeaway: always check what subsurface rights come with your property deed. They might be worth more than the house. The energy company had already paid $10 million in advance royalties, money that had been laundered through Bradley's consulting firm and Vivian's law practice. The lease included pipeline easements affecting every single house in Magnolia Estates, meaning their property values would crater once industrial extraction began. I contacted Meridian Energy directly, explained that their $10 million lease had been signed by someone who didn't own the mineral rights, offered them a choice: void the fraudulent contract and negotiate with the actual property owner, or watch their investment disappear in federal court. The electric tension in their corporate office conference room was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. 3 days later, I had a new contract, 50% royalties, $20 million signing bonus, and full environmental oversight of any extraction operations. Plus, Meridian's legal team would support my property claim as part of protecting their legitimate business interests. The neighborhood Facebook group exploded when residents learned about the gas lease. Half blamed me for industrializing their community. The other half blamed Vivian for signing away their property values without their knowledge. Children were forbidden from playing in certain yards as parents chose sides in the escalating civil war. But the sweetest moment came when Vivian tried one last desperate play. She organized a community safety meeting at the clubhouse, built on my property, remember, and invited the entire neighborhood to discuss protecting our families from outside threats. 200 angry homeowners packed into the room. Vivian stood at the front, perfectly coiffed and confident, ready to rally the troops against the dangerous outsider. That's when I walked in and handed her an eviction notice. "Mrs. Blackwood," I announced to the stunned crowd, "you're trespassing on private property. You have 30 days to vacate the premises." A scratch of pens on paper as residents frantically took notes sounded like mice in the walls. The meeting dissolved into chaos. Half the crowd demanded Vivian's resignation. The other half shouted threats at me. Someone called the sheriff. Someone else called the news. But the most beautiful sound of all was Vivian's voice cracking as she tried to maintain control of a situation that had completely escaped her grasp. The smoking gun came from the most unlikely source, Martha Sandoval's basement filing cabinet. "I kept copies of everything," Martha explained, leading me down creaky wooden steps into her cluttered basement. 38 years of county clerk work teaches you that politicians have selective memory problems. The musty smell of old documents and mouse droppings filled the air as she opened a metal filing cabinet marked Insurance Files, Do Not Discard. Inside were photocopies of meeting minutes, financial records, and recorded transcripts that were supposed to have been accidentally destroyed in a county office water leak 3 months earlier. The first bombshell? Bradley Blackwood hadn't just known about my property ownership. He'd attended a closed-door county commission meeting where they specifically discussed how to resolve the Kowalski problem. The meeting minutes, in Martha's careful handwriting, showed commissioners discussing eminent domain alternatives and edited development approval process. Vivian had been there too, not as a resident, but as Pinnacle Construction's legal counsel. The meeting happened 6 months before the first house was built, 18 months before she moved into the neighborhood. She'd been planning this theft from the beginning. But the real revelation was bigger than just my property. Martha's files contained evidence of similar schemes across 12 rural communities in Georgia. The same pattern: target absent military families, overseas workers, or elderly landowners, use shell companies to build developments on disputed land, corrupt local officials to provide retroactive approvals, then declare the original owners troublemakers trying to steal homes from innocent families. Vivian's law firm hadn't just specialized in clearing problematic titles. They'd pioneered a systematic method for stealing rural property. They called it productive land use optimization, which sounded much better than organized theft in their marketing materials. The financial web was staggering. HOA fees throughout the affected communities had been artificially inflated to funnel money into Bradley's campaign fund. County building inspectors, planning commissioners, and even some judges had received consulting fees from the development companies. The total fraud exceeded $100 million across multiple counties. But here's what hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. My grandmother's original deed contained a covenant I'd never noticed. The land was to be used for the benefit of the community and its children. Babskiaya had included that clause because she remembered the Depression, when neighbors helped neighbors survive. The weight of that revelation settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about recovering my property anymore. It was about honoring my grandmother's vision while stopping these parasites from destroying other families. The mineral lease money could fund something meaningful: scholarships, community programs, maybe even affordable housing for working families. Martha's final surprise was the most dangerous: recorded phone calls between Vivian and federal energy regulators. She'd been trying to expedite pipeline approval by claiming she represented affected landowners who supported the project. The recordings proved she'd been impersonating me in conversations with federal agencies. That's a federal felony, multiple federal felonies actually. The warm feeling of purpose replacing cold anger was like stepping from winter into spring sunlight. I called my cousin Tommy at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, investigative journalist with a nose for corruption and a personal grudge against HOA abuse, sent him copies of everything Martha had given me. "Thad," he said after reviewing the files, "this isn't just about your property. This is the biggest rural property theft scheme in Georgia history. We're talking Pulitzer Prize territory." Within hours, federal investigators were already building cases against the entire conspiracy. My RICO lawsuit had become key evidence in a multi-state investigation. Vivian and Bradley weren't just facing civil liability. They were looking at decades in federal prison. The sound of wind through cemetery trees during my visit to Babchia's grave seemed to whisper approval. Building a team to take down a criminal conspiracy is like assembling a crew for an offshore drilling operation. You need specialists who can handle pressure and won't crack when things get dangerous. Martha Sandoval became my intelligence officer. 38 years of county records were stored in her memory like a human filing system. She knew which officials took bribes, which judges played golf with developers, and exactly how much money had changed hands in backroom deals. Jake Morrison was my forensic accountant, recommended by a petroleum engineer I'd worked with in the Gulf. Jake specialized in following money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and the kind of creative bookkeeping that made Enron look amateur. The scratch of his calculator and the buzz of multiple computer screens running financial analysis software became the soundtrack of our war room. Rebecca Chin, environmental lawyer with 15 years fighting energy companies, joined when she learned about the fraudulent gas lease. She'd spent her career untangling exactly this kind of corporate government corruption. Her specialty was forcing disclosure of environmental impact studies and catching regulators who rubber-stamped dangerous projects. Tommy Kowalski, my journalist cousin, became our media strategist. While the feds built their criminal case, Tommy was crafting a narrative that would expose the pattern of rural property theft to the entire country. His investigation would run in 3 parts: the conspiracy, the victims, and the cover-up. Our legal strategy was multi-pronged warfare: federal RICO charges to invoke treble damages, state fraud charges to pierce corporate veils, environmental lawsuits to halt pipeline construction, asset seizure petitions to freeze every bank account the conspirators touched. The smell of Chinese takeout and stale coffee filled my grandmother's kitchen as we worked 18-hour days mapping the conspiracy. Jake's financial audit revealed the scope of the theft. Vivian's law firm had received $12 million in consulting fees from development companies. Bradley's campaign fund had been artificially inflated by HOA fee diversions from 8 communities. Even the county assessor had received monthly payments disguised as property evaluation services. Knowledge nugget time. Title insurance doesn't protect against fraud by the seller when the seller never owned the property in the first place. Takeaway: always verify property ownership through multiple sources, not just title companies. Rebecca's environmental strategy was brilliant. She demanded full disclosure of all environmental impact studies for the gas extraction project. When Meridian Energy couldn't produce legitimate studies because Vivian had submitted falsified documents, the entire project faced federal shutdown. But my favorite part was the energy company gambit. I contacted 3 competing gas companies and told them Meridian's lease was fraudulent. Suddenly, there was a bidding war for legitimate mineral rights to property worth $50 million in natural gas deposits. Competition is beautiful. Meridian's original offer of $20 million became $40 million when ExxonMobil entered the bidding. Then Shell offered $60 million plus environmental cleanup guarantees. By the time the dust settled, I had an $80 million deal that included community benefit agreements, environmental monitoring, and cleanup bonds. The click of computer keys as Jake traced financial transactions sounded like rain on a tin roof. Meanwhile, we were building a coalition of victims from the other affected communities. Turns out, when you systematically steal rural property, you create a lot of angry farmers, veterans, and working families. Our victim database included over 300 families across 12 counties. Tommy's investigative series would profile the human cost of the conspiracy: elderly couples losing family farms, military families returning from deployment to find their land developed, working families bankrupted by legal fees fighting fraudulent evictions. The technical preparation was military precise: professional property surveys with GPS coordinates accurate to 3 inches, title searches going back 150 years to establish clear ownership chain, environmental assessments supporting the gas lease negotiations, engineering studies of pipeline routes that minimized disruption to existing homes. Our media campaign would launch simultaneously with federal arrests, Tommy's series in the Journal Constitution, social media campaign targeting property fraud awareness. A documentary filmmaker who specialized in corporate corruption stories had already expressed interest in the broader conspiracy. But the most satisfying element was community intelligence gathering. We identified residents in Magnolia Estates who'd grown suspicious of Vivian's leadership, documented HOA rule violations by her allies, gathered evidence of discriminatory enforcement against minority families and single mothers. Here's another knowledge nugget. Mineral rights can be severed from surface rights in most states, meaning you might own your house but not what's underneath it. Check your deed carefully. Subsurface rights might belong to someone else entirely. The final piece was coordination with federal investigators. My evidence became their evidence. Our financial analysis supported their money laundering charges. Our victim interviews provided testimony for their conspiracy case. The buzz of multiple phone conversations coordinating legal strategy filled the farmhouse like electricity before a storm. By the time we were ready to spring our trap, we had federal prosecutors, state investigators, environmental regulators, and national media all working toward the same goal: complete destruction of a criminal conspiracy that had stolen over $100 million from rural American families. Cornered animals are dangerous, and Vivian Blackwood was about to prove that desperate criminals with political connections can be downright lethal. The accidental fire at the county records building happened on a Thursday night. Conveniently, the only files destroyed were those related to property disputes from the past 5 years. The fire department ruled it electrical failure, but somehow the sprinkler system had mysteriously malfunctioned in just that one storage room. The acrid smell of smoke and burned paper hung over downtown for 3 days, like evidence cremated in real time. But destroying public records wasn't enough for Vivian. She needed to destroy me personally. Enter Danny Kozlov, a disgruntled roughneck I'd fired from a North Sea rig 2 years earlier for showing up drunk. Suddenly, Danny was giving interviews to local news claiming I was unstable, violent, and had threatened crew members with violence. The interview was amateur hour. Danny couldn't keep his story straight, forgot which rig we'd supposedly worked together, and accidentally mentioned Vivian had paid him $5,000 for his courage in speaking out. The reporters smelled a setup faster than sharks detect blood. Meanwhile, the harassment escalated to physical intimidation. My truck got vandalized 3 times in 1 week. Tires slashed, windows broken, land thief keyed into the paint. The security cameras mysteriously malfunctioned during each incident, except for my backup system that Vivienne didn't know about. The real escalation came when they tried to poison my dog. Rex was a German Shepherd mix I'd adopted from a shelter, trained as a guard dog for the property. Someone threw antifreeze-laced hamburger meat over my fence. If I hadn't caught Rex before he ate it, they would have murdered my dog to send a message. The metallic taste of rage filled my mouth as I collected the poisoned meat for evidence. That's when I called Marcus Webb, a retired Marine Corps security consultant I'd worked with on overseas contracts. Marcus specialized in protecting executives from kidnapping in hostile countries. Protecting one machinist from HOA terrorists was vacation duty for him. Mini twist time. Marcus recognized the hired thugs immediately. They were off-duty sheriff's deputies from Paulding County, moonlighting for a private security firm owned by Bradley Blackwood's brother-in-law. The corruption network extended across county lines, with law enforcement officers acting as enforcers for the property theft conspiracy. Here's your knowledge nugget. Witness intimidation automatically elevates civil fraud cases to federal felony charges with mandatory minimum sentences. Takeaway: document all harassment. It often leads to much bigger criminal charges than the original crime. The federal interest was immediate and overwhelming. FBI agents opened a RICO investigation into the Multi-County conspiracy. My protected witness status meant federal marshals were monitoring my property 24/7. The harassment stopped immediately when word spread that federal agents were involved. But the community fracture was devastating to watch. Magnolia Estates had become an armed camp. Some residents hired private security companies to protect their families from outside threats. Others organized neighborhood watch groups to monitor suspicious activity. Children weren't allowed to play outside after dark. The neighborhood Facebook group had devolved into a digital war zone. Threats, accusations, and paranoid conspiracy theories dominated every discussion. Longtime neighbors stopped speaking to each other. Property showings ceased entirely as real estate agents refused to enter what they called the combat zone. Vivian's panic response was spectacular in its desperation. She attempted to flee the country with hidden offshore accounts containing $2 million cash. TSA agents found the money in her luggage at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, packed in vacuum-sealed bags inside empty shampoo bottles. The sound of helicopters circling during federal raids became the neighborhood's new background noise. Her husband Bradley collapsed during the FBI raid on their house. Heart attack, according to the ambulance crew, though it looked more like a panic attack when agents started reading him his rights. Bradley's medical emergency didn't stop the search warrant execution. Federal agents just worked around the paramedic. Pinnacle construction executives started plea negotiations the moment their bank accounts got frozen. Amazing how quickly corporate loyalty evaporates when people face 20-year prison sentences. They were offering testimony against Vivian and Bradley in exchange for reduced charges. The most beautiful sound was Vivian's voice on the wiretapped phone calls, becoming more shrill and desperate as her world collapsed. The FBI had been recording her conversations for weeks, capturing detailed confessions about the entire conspiracy. But the ultimate vindication came when the energy company investigation revealed the full scope of the mineral rights fraud. Vivian hadn't just forged my signature on one lease, she'd been forging signatures for dozens of property owners across multiple states. The federal energy fraud charges alone carried a potential life sentence. The crunch of broken glass from vandalized security cameras mixed with the mechanical hum of federal surveillance equipment created a symphony of justice in motion. Desperation turned Vivian Blackwood into something far more dangerous than a corrupt HOA president. It turned her into a woman with nothing left to lose. Her final gambit was pure scorched earth. If she couldn't keep the stolen property, she'd destroy it for everyone else. Emergency HOA meeting, mandatory attendance, special assessment of $25,000 per household to purchase the entire development from a shell company she'd created overnight. The plan was diabolical in its simplicity. Transfer all 120 properties to Magnolia Holdings LLC, a company she secretly owned. Drain every homeowner's savings through the emergency assessment, then declare the HOA bankrupt, leaving families homeless while she disappeared with millions in extracted equity. But Vivian's desperation made her sloppy. She didn't know about my friendship with Judge Patricia Morrison, Jake's sister and the federal magistrate handling asset forfeiture in my case. When Vivian tried to execute her property transfer scheme, Judge Morrison issued an immediate restraining order freezing all real estate transactions in Magnolia Estates. The sabotage escalated beyond property theft into attempted murder. Someone contaminated my well water with industrial chemicals, specifically methylene chloride from a dry cleaning operation. The chemical smell was barely detectable, but lab tests revealed concentrations high enough to cause liver failure within weeks. If I hadn't been paranoid enough to test my water supply, I'd be dead. The arson attempt came next. 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, Derek Blackwood and 2 accomplices tried to burn down my grandmother's farmhouse with me inside. They used an accelerant trail from the barn to the house, figuring the old wood would go up like kindling. What they didn't know, Marcus Webb had installed military-grade motion sensors throughout the property. The alarm system woke me before they lit the first match. My security footage captured everything in infrared, 3 figures pouring gasoline, lighting the trail, then panicking when the fire spread faster than expected. The sound of sirens cutting through rural Georgia darkness was sweeter than gospel music. Mini twist time, the FBI sting operation had been running for weeks. Agent Sarah Chen, posing as a corrupt energy company lawyer, had been meeting with Vivian to discuss resolving the ownership problem permanently. Vivian confessed to the entire conspiracy on tape, including her plan to frame me for threatening federal agents. The wire recordings were devastating. Vivian admitting she targeted military families specifically because those people are always deployed and can't defend their property. Describing me as just another dumb veteran who doesn't understand how the system works. Planning to have me declared mentally incompetent and committed to a state facility. But the most damning evidence was her casual discussion of similar schemes across multiple states. Vivian's operation had stolen rural property worth over $300 million from more than 1,000 families. She kept detailed records of every theft, every forged document, every bribed official. The federal response was swift and overwhelming. Simultaneous raids on properties in 12 counties, asset forfeiture of everything Vivian and Bradley owned, houses, cars, bank accounts, even Vivian's jewelry collection. The FBI seized financial records going back 15 years. The community awakening was painful, but necessary. Residents finally understood they'd been living in a criminal enterprise disguised as a suburban neighborhood. Their property values weren't just declining. They were living on stolen land with clouded titles that made their homes essentially worthless. The weight of responsibility as the story went national was crushing. Congressional hearings on rural property fraud, documentary crews filming the destruction of the American dream, my phone ringing constantly with reporters, victims from other states, and lawyers offering to represent more fraud victims. But the most satisfying moment was Vivian's final breakdown. Caught red-handed with evidence of arson, attempted murder, and federal conspiracy charges, she tried one last desperate play, claiming she was the real victim of a federal conspiracy to steal property from hard-working American families. The press conference was spectacular. Vivian, flanked by 2 public defenders who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, sobbing about government overreach, while federal prosecutors read a 47-count indictment, wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, attempted murder, arson, and leading a criminal enterprise. Meich ruled, I had never done everything I was asked to do while I was up at 3rd grade. It was way too. The flash of camera lights during her perp walk illuminated the complete collapse of her carefully constructed facade. Bradley's cooperation came immediately. Faced with life in prison, he provided testimony against Vivian, Pinnacle Construction, and 14 county officials across 3 states. His detailed confession revealed the scope of a corruption network that had infected rural Georgia like cancer. The chemical smell of document preservation spray filled the federal evidence warehouse as investigators cataloged thousands of fraudulent documents. Every forged signature, every falsified permit, every bribed approval was being preserved for what prosecutors called the largest rural property fraud case in American history. But through it all, the most beautiful sound was silence. The absence of Vivian's voice, her threats, her lies, her attempts to destroy my family's legacy. The county courthouse hadn't seen crowds like this since the civil rights protests of the 1,960. 600 people packed into a building designed for half that number, with overflow crowds watching on big screens set up in the parking lot. News vans from Atlanta, Jacksonville, and Nashville lined the streets. Federal marshals provided security as the biggest corruption trial in Georgia history reached its climax. Vivian Blackwood arrived in handcuffs but had been released on a $1 million bond pending trial. Her designer clothes couldn't hide the hollow look in her eyes or the tremor in her hands. Bradley sat separately, having already pled guilty and agreed to testify against his wife in exchange for a reduced sentence. The buzz of hundreds of conversations created a noise like angry wasps as residents, media, and federal investigators filled every available seat. Judge Patricia Morrison called for order as the Emergency County Commission meeting began. The official agenda was simple: vote on whether to void all fraudulent development approvals and return stolen property to rightful owners. The real agenda was public accountability for 15 years of systemic corruption. Commissioner Williams, who'd somehow avoided the FBI dragnet, called the first witness. Vivian stood at the podium, defiant despite the federal charges hanging over her head. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice cracking slightly, "I stand before you as a victim of federal overreach and a conspiracy to destroy our community. For years, I've worked tirelessly to build Magnolia Estates into a model neighborhood where families could pursue the American dream." The crowd stirred restlessly. Someone in the back shouted, "What about the families you stole from?" Vivian's composure slipped. "I never stole anything. Every development was properly approved through legitimate county processes. If there were paperwork irregularities, they were the result of county incompetence, not criminal intent." She pointed directly at me, sitting in the front row with my legal team. "This man, this outsider, is destroying the lives of 120 innocent families because he wants to profit from a legal technicality. He's trying to steal homes from hard-working Americans." The metallic taste of controlled anger filled my mouth as she continued her lies. "As members of this community," Vivian's voice rose to evangelical fervor, "we cannot allow government agents and outside agitators to destroy what we've built together. These people target successful communities because they hate seeing ordinary Americans prosper." That's when Agent Sarah Chen stood up from her seat in the gallery, the same FBI agent who'd been posing as a corrupt lawyer to gather evidence against Vivian. "Your Honor," Agent Chen announced, "I'd like to present evidence directly relevant to Mrs. Blackwood's testimony." The courtroom fell silent as Agent Chen activated a portable speaker system. Vivian's voice filled the room, clear as crystal from the wire recordings. "Those people are always deployed and can't defend their property. Military families, overseas workers, they're perfect targets, because by the time they discover what happened, we've already sold half the lots." Vivian's face went white as her own words condemned her. The recording continued. "That Kowalski veteran thinks he can threaten our operation? I've destroyed bigger men than him. We'll have him declared mentally incompetent and committed to a state facility. Problem solved." The crowd exploded. Shouts of rage, calls for justice, the sound of 600 people realizing they'd been living in a criminal enterprise. Federal marshals moved to maintain order as residents surged toward the witness stand. Judge Morrison gavelled for silence, but the damage was done. Vivian's public facade had cracked completely. That's when I stood up and walked to the podium. The room quieted as I faced the community that had been built on my stolen land. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the packed courthouse, "you called me an outsider, but my family has owned this land for 80 years. My grandmother grew vegetables on this soil during the Depression to feed her neighbors, for free. She included a covenant in the original deed requiring this land benefit the entire community." I turned to address the crowd. "You're not my enemies. You're victims of the same criminal conspiracy that targeted my family. Vivian Blackwood didn't just steal my property. She stole your security, your property values, and your trust in the American dream." The flash of cameras captured every word as I delivered my prepared statement. Today, I am announcing the creation of the Babcia Kowalski Community Trust, funded by Mineral Rights Settlements. $80 million for scholarships, affordable housing, and community development. Because my grandmother always said, land should help families build better lives, not destroy them. The standing ovation lasted 3 full minutes. Even some of Vivian's former allies were applauding as the truth finally sank in. Commissioner Williams called for the vote, unanimous approval to void all fraudulent permits and return property to legitimate ownership, unanimous approval for criminal referrals to federal prosecutors, and unanimous approval for Vivian Blackwood's immediate removal from all county positions. As federal marshals escorted a sobbing Vivian from the courthouse, her final words were captured by every camera. "This isn't over. You'll regret destroying me." But it was over. The mic had been dropped, and justice had been served. 6 months later, I'm standing in what used to be my grandmother's vegetable garden, watching kids play on swings funded by mineral rights money that criminals tried to steal. The sound of children's laughter where Babcia once grew her prize-winning tomatoes feels like the universe coming full circle. Vivian Blackwood received 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, and racketeering. Her husband Bradley got 10 years plus $50 million in restitution after his full cooperation with prosecutors. 14 county officials across 3 states faced federal charges, and the FBI expanded their investigation to 12 other states where similar schemes had been operating. The Pinnacle construction executives flipped faster than pancakes at a church breakfast, providing evidence that led to the conviction of the entire criminal network. Their detailed testimony revealed over $300 million in stolen rural property across the Southeast. But the real victory wasn't the prison sentences, it was what we built from the ashes of corruption. The Babcia Kowalski Community Trust started with $80 million from the mineral rights settlement, but grew to over $120 million when other energy companies bid for extraction rights. The trust operates under strict environmental guidelines, with community oversight and guaranteed cleanup bonds. Every family in Magnolia Estates received clear title to their property at no cost. The trust paid all legal fees, title searches, and even property tax adjustments. Nobody lost their home because of Vivian's crimes. In fact, property values stabilized once the legal cloud was lifted and the Community Development Fund was established. The scholarship program has already changed lives. Emma Rodriguez, whose single mother cleaned houses to afford their mortgage, received a full ride to Georgia Tech for engineering. Marcus Thompson, son of a deployed Army sergeant, got into Emory pre-med with all expenses covered. 68 kids in the first year alone, with priority given to children of military families and working-class parents. The annual Babcia Kowalski Community Festival happens every September on the anniversary of her birth. Last year, over 3,000 people attended. We serve pierogi made from her original recipe, host live music on a stage built where the old barn used to stand, and present scholarships to local students. Even some of Vivian's former supporters volunteer at the food booths now. The community center, built on land I donated adjacent to the subdivision, hosts everything from voter registration drives to senior citizen meals. The smell of fresh coffee and friendly conversation fills the building most mornings as neighbors, who once glared at each other across property lines, now work together on community projects. But my favorite part is the community garden. 40 raised beds where residents grow vegetables, herbs, and flowers. Martha Sandoval, now 81, teaches traditional canning methods to young mothers. Kids learn where food comes from. Families who couldn't afford fresh produce now have garden plots that feed them year-round. The environmental monitoring program ensures gas extraction operations meet the highest safety standards. Community representatives inspect every pipeline, monitor air and water quality, and have veto power over any operations that threaten public health. The energy companies initially resisted the oversight, but discovered that community support actually makes their operations more efficient. Tommy's investigative series won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing rural property fraud schemes across the country. His documentary Stolen Land, The American Dream Hijacked led to congressional hearings and new federal protections for overseas workers and military families. The story sparked similar investigations in 15 other states. I live in the renovated farmhouse now, surrounded by a community that understands the difference between neighbors and predators. The taste of well water that runs clear and sweet reminds me daily that some victories are worth fighting for, no matter how long it takes. The texture of rich Georgia soil between my fingers as I plant Babcia's heirloom tomatoes connects me to 3 generations of family history. but it's the sound of children playing safely in their yards that tells me we've honored her memory properly. Here's your call to action. If you've dealt with HOA corruption, property fraud, or any situation where powerful people tried to steal what your family worked for, share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else avoid the same trap. And remember to hit that subscribe button for more stories about ordinary people fighting back against extraordinary corruption. Because sometimes, when you refuse to give up, the little guy really does win. Your grandmother's land might be worth more than you think. Check those deeds. Know your rights. And never let anyone tell you that working people can't fight City Hall and win.